Now, Libyans are marking the anniversary of the start of the revolution which toppled Colonel Gaddafi. Celebrations are being held in towns and cities across the country, but there are also fears of instability, largely because of former rebel fighters who have yet to hand over their weapons. Our correspondent Gabriel Gatehouse is in Libya and sent this report.
This is where it all began, the protests that turned into a revolution that eventually toppled one of the most entrenched dictatorships of the last half-century.
Benghazi is, of course, the birthplace of the revolt that ousted Muammar Gaddafi, and the people here are fiercely proud of that fact. But this is still a country where groups of armed men wield disproportionate influence, and 1 year on, Libya's revolution still feels, in many respects, like unfinished business.
Away from the jubilations, rival militias squabble over territory, often with violent consequences. Libya's new government is trying to incorporate these former rebel brigades into a national army, but so far they've had limited success. Last spring, Dr. Ahmed Majawal was one of thousands of young men who risked their lives to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi's brutal dictatorship. Now, as reports emerge of former rebels torturing their captured enemies, he says Libya needs a new psychological revolution.
Gaddafi gone, and his family gone, okay? But his regime and his ideals still imprinted in many minds. So we have to change these minds, have to change ideas.
Most Libyans agree that the freedoms that have come with their revolution are changing their lives for the better. But until the militias disarm, behind the facade of a new and stable life lurks the danger of a return to violence. Gabriel Gatehouse, BBC News in Benghazi.
Well, let's talk about this a little more. Joining me in the studio is Willem Marx, a journalist and independent filmmaker who spent most of the last year reporting from Libya. Thanks so much for coming in. In terms of a year, what an extraordinary year it was. When you were there, did you get the sense that it would change so dramatically and so fast?
I think the optimism I encountered when I first went out there last spring led me to believe that there were going to be ongoing changes for the following year. But going back there last month and seeing how calm Tripoli was relative to what I'd seen in the east in Benghazi the year before, it was really startling. So
just give us a snapshot in terms of quite how much has changed. We know the regime has gone in terms of what is now in its place, because so often when these things happen, it's easy to take one's eye off the ball in terms of what happens afterwards.
Well, I think right now Libya is in a very much a limbo, and until the elections later this year, probably in June, the transitional government is not wanting to make big decisions, and in fact a lot of people would argue that they're not able to make many big decisions. They've got a lot of pressure from the militias, like Gabriel Gatehouse was talking about there. And a lot of people are very uncertain about the future, especially when it comes to the economy.
You mentioned the militias. I mean, we heard right at the end, as soon as Gaddafi had gone, that the attempt was to actually get the arms off the streets, and that has singularly failed, hasn't it?
It really has, and talking to militia commanders there, they will say, you know, this is my area, I'm protecting it, and they see themselves as guardians of the new Libya. They don't want to give up their weapons because they're worried about the people. They don't know who are in power. The NTC, the interim government there, is very unwilling to often identify itself. The people involved aren't very public.
So much of the engine of change came from young people based around the economy, their prospects. Now, you were specifically looking at that in the film that you made. Again, what is the situation on the ground when it comes to those sorts of issues?
Well, you know, one of the things a lot of people we spoke to were looking for was foreign investment, foreign expertise, and until the security situation stabilised, you're not going to have many Western businesses coming in and wanting to do work there in Libya. So a lot of the young people who took up arms, like you said last year, because of economic problems, not having jobs, not having opportunities, are still just as frustrated a year on as they were then.
Very quick final thought in terms of democracy. You talked about elections. I mean, you had one man leading this country for such a long time. How difficult is it going to be just changing the culture across the country?
Well, it's funny you asked. There was a study released yesterday by the University of Benghazi and Oxford, a joint study, and it found that of the, I think, 2,000 people interviewed, only about 15% actually said they wanted to see a democracy installed there within the next year. And that the vast majority asked for sort of strong leadership, and that may change, but at the moment that seems to be the pervasive view.
Very interesting. Willem Marx, thanks for coming in to talk to us. Thank you.
Now, Libyans are marking the first anniversary of the start of the revolution which toppled Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Celebrations are planned in towns and cities across the country, but there are also fears of instability, largely because significant numbers of former rebel fighters have yet to hand over their weapons to the central government. Willem Marx is a journalist and independent filmmaker who spent much of the last year reporting from Libya, and I'm delighted to say he's here in the GMT studio. Willem, I know you're just back from your most recent trip and you've been looking at conditions on the ground in Tripoli and beyond Tripoli as well. Broad brush, what is your impression of stability, the level of stability?
It's not great, to be honest. I mean, on a given day in the capital Tripoli, you'll hear gunfire. There'll be checkpoints every few hundred meters whenever there's any kind of uncertainty. And uncertainty is the key word there at the moment. The transitional government is unwilling to make big decisions about the future of the country, and so many Libyans described it to me as a situation of being in limbo, essentially.
What we have heard from some of the former rebel brigade leaders is that they have had no real contract with the central authority. The central authority doesn't appear willing to integrate them into the new national Libyan security force, and there's real tension there. Did you feel that?
Yes, I mean, I think speaking to a lot of the ministers there, they said that, quite frankly, they're unable to do a lot of things because they are worried about the power of these brigades, these militias. And then on the other side, when you talk to the militia leaders, they say, well, we never get any contact from them. We have very little relationship with them. There's no police, there's no central army, there's no sort of authority figure who's going to take control of them.
You went to Zawiya, for example, where there was some fierce fighting. I wonder, when you walk around a town like Zawiya and when you're trying to do interviews and whatever, who seems to be in control?
Very much the militia fighters. I mean, we were there, for example, in Zawiya. One of the big refineries in Libya is located there. And we were trying to film in and around the refinery, and the militia fighters had nothing of it. They really weren't very happy with us being there. And there's no one you can really appeal to. It's the guys with the guns, and they're the ones in charge.
And if you're experiencing that as a journalist on the ground, I expect business people who are trying to get into Libya to begin the process of doing deals, reviving the oil industry, for example, they must be finding difficulties too.
I'd imagine so, and you know, they may be not quite so used to seeing guys with guns who are swaggering around a city. You know, a lot of the Western businesses we met there said that sort of instability and a lack of security is their major problem right now. And without that improving, they don't see necessarily they're going to be willing to come in large numbers with their personnel to continue doing business.
I heard the Deputy Prime Minister of the transitional government yesterday saying that there was so much optimism in the country and that the Libyan people, they realised there were some teething issues, but they were absolutely confident that things would get better over the next year. Do you think that's true?
I think that is largely true. Most people we met were very optimistic, but it was often tempered with this proviso that, you know, we are worried about a certain number of things, one of which is insecurity, one of which is potential of corruption. And, you know, the idea that the government doesn't have a central unified command over the armed forces, these militias, is major for many people, I think.
Well, Willem Marx, thanks very much for coming and sharing your experience on GMT. Still to come on the programme,